A spear can hit you from 6 feet away. A club needs almost no skill to swing. A sharpened stone can cut a rope, skin an animal, end a fight in seconds. So why would anyone bother inventing something else, a long, narrow piece of metal shaped for one purpose only, that only works if you get close enough to use it? That's the strange part. The sword is, in a lot of ways, a worse weapon than what came before it. And yet humans built it anyway. The real question isn't when the sword showed up, it's why anyone thought it was worth the trouble, and how they even figured out how to make one. Long before anyone was casting metal, humans were already well armed. Sharpened stone blades go back tens of thousands of years. Clubs, spears, and thrown projectiles handled most of the work: hunting, defense, conflict between groups. The spear, in particular, was close to perfect for its time. It kept you at a distance from whatever you were fighting, whether that was an animal or another person. It was cheap to make and easy to replace. If you already have a weapon that reaches farther than an arm's length, there's no obvious reason to invent one that requires you to stand close enough to be hit back. The shift started somewhere else entirely. Not with weapons, but with rock. At some point, people in the ancient Near East noticed that certain stones, when heated, didn't just crack or crumble, they changed. Native copper had been cold hammered into small objects for a long time, but by roughly the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, communities across the region were smelting copper from ore, heating it until it could be poured and shaped. That was new. For the first time, a tool didn't have to be found in nature. It could be made. Copper had a problem, though. It's soft. A copper blade can be sharpened, but it dulls fast, and it bends under real pressure. Early metalworkers weren't chemists. They didn't understand atomic structure or alloying in any scientific sense, but they were paying attention. And somewhere along the way, they noticed that copper mixed with other materials, arsenic in some of the earliest cases, pH, behaved differently. It held an edge longer, it resisted bending. Nobody wrote this down as a discovery because writing barely existed yet. It got passed down the way most ancient knowledge did, hand to hand, workshop to workshop. This is where things get genuinely interesting, and where the story gets a little messier than most people expect. In the 1980s, archaeologists working at Arslantepe, a mound site in what's now eastern Turkey, uncovered a cache of 9-bladed weapons, swords, and daggers, buried in a building linked to a ruling elite. They dated to around 3,300 to 3000 BCE, made from an arsenic copper alloy, some inlaid with silver. That's earlier than anyone expected to find anything resembling a sword. Before that discovery, most archaeologists placed the earliest true swords over 1,000 years later, well into the Bronze Age proper. But here's the catch, and it matters. The Arslantepe blades are somewhere between 45 and 60 centimeters long. Depending on who you ask, that puts them right on the line between long dagger and short sword. Archaeologists don't define a sword just by length. They look at the shape, how the blade was hafted to a handle, how it was likely used, and the context it was found in. A weapon meant to be swung is built differently than one meant to stab. So even now, researchers debate exactly where to draw the line, which means there may never be one clean, universally agreed upon first sword. What Arslantepe does show clearly is that people were already experimenting with long metal blades a lot earlier than we assumed. Bronze, copper deliberately alloyed with tin, pushed things further. It wasn't always dramatically stronger than every earlier alloy, and it didn't appear everywhere at once. But bronze could be cast reliably, which meant metalworkers could pour it into molds and produce more complex, more consistent shapes than hammering alone allowed. By the 2nd millennium BCE, recognizable bronze swords were being produced across the eastern Mediterranean and parts of Europe and Asia. Longer, more balanced, clearly built for combat rather than just utility. Even then, making a good blade wasn't simple. Too soft, and it bends in a fight. Too brittle, and it snaps. Metalworkers had to balance hardness against flexibility, using nothing but fire, hammers, and inherited intuition. They couldn't measure carbon content or test tensile strength. They learned through failure. A blade that broke told them something, even if they couldn't have explained it in scientific terms. Over generations, that trial and error hardened into craft knowledge, passed from master to apprentice. Iron eventually entered the picture, though not as a sudden replacement for bronze. The transition was slow and regionally uneven. In some places, ironworking took root centuries before it did elsewhere, and bronze weapons stayed in use long after iron became available. What iron eventually offered, once smiths learned to control it, was access to steel. Iron worked with carbon in the right amounts, under the right heat. Get that balance right, and you get a blade that's both hard and resilient in a way earlier metals struggled to match. Get it wrong, and the result is worse than what you started with. This wasn't a single breakthrough moment. It was centuries of smiths, in different regions, slowly learning to control a material they didn't fully understand. By the time reliable steel swords existed, the sword had already become something more than a weapon. It signaled status. Owning one, especially a well-made one, meant access to skilled labor, trade networks, and resources most people didn't have. Swords turn up in graves, in temples, in royal iconography, not always as battlefield tools, but as symbols of authority and craftsmanship. That dual identity, practical weapon and prestige object, seems to have existed almost from the start. So how did humans invent the sword? Not in one moment, and not through one person's idea. It came out of a long chain, people learning to heat stone into metal, learning that some metals could be combined into something better, learning that shape and technique mattered as much as material, and slowly discovering how to control heat and composition well enough to make something that doesn't occur anywhere in nature. Each generation inherited a little more skill than the one before it, and pushed it slightly further. Humans started by shaping stone. Eventually, they learned to shape fire itself. And the sword was what came out the other side.